All right, guys, welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. DeCecco. So, your previous episode should have been America in World War II, but foreign issues. This is going to take you through America and World War II domestic issues. So, our focus today is going to be on what was happening inside of America during the war. So, let's get it going. And this is a famous picture that you'd see from World War II. This would be your typical Rosie the Riveter who got involved in the workforce and certainly was doing work in factories because men were off to war. So first thing we'll talk about is American patriotism, and that is everybody in America wanted to do something to help win the war. So if you were drafted, maybe you went and fought. If you maybe bought some war bonds, or maybe if you signed up for the military, you went off to war. But what if you were still at home? So Americans at home supported the war in many different ways. And the first one was rationing. And the government will ration certain items, food, gasoline, other necessities. Flour was a big one back then. And just you're not going to use as much as you would so that we have more to feed the troops, all right? People did things like had meatless Tuesdays, wheatless Wednesdays. They planted victory gardens in their backyards. So on the large commercial farms, all of that food would be sent over to feed the troops. And of course, the government needed money for that war, so the purchasing or the buying of war bonds was a way for you to help out with that time period. So this is something you might see. You might only get 2 pounds of sugar per month. And that would be your allotment, right? We must confine our consumption of sugar to not more than 2 pounds per person per month in order to provide a restricted ration to England, France, and Italy. So those would be our allies, right? And kind of a nice little slogan, meatless days, wheatless days, food will win the war, right? We need bullets, but we also need food. And the other thing is, as long as the government had money, so the buying of war bonds would allow the government to use your money during that war, the government would be able to fund the war effort. So we're going to spend a lot of time on women, right? More so in World War II than World War I. They played a very large role in World War II, and that is because men were being positioned to go over and fight that war. So what did women do in the military? Well, just so you know, over 200,000 women joined the military during World War II. They did serve in separate units than men, and they were kind of non-combat duties, if you will, right? But the WAC was kind of a big one. So the Woman Army Corps performed military duties, radios, repaired airplanes and vehicles, and clerical duties, and pushing letters around for the military and correspondence. So, I mean, the role of American women was really big during World War II for the military. So, here it is. I mean, if you're a girl with a Star-Spangled Heart, you may join the WAC. And once again, the WAC is the Woman Army Corps. All right, so you see that. Well, in the civilian workforce, really, because men were off to war, women had to join. So they took jobs in those factories that were occupied by men. Over 5 million women worked in factories devoted specifically to producing wartime goods. All right, they took jobs that were typically, done by men before, but when they got those jobs, they were paid less than what men were being paid to do the same work. So you have that, and you have that iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. So there's 2 women working in a defense industry, working, and there she is, willing to do her part, and there's that iconic pin that you may see, right? So Rosie the Riveter. Well, what were some of the resulting changes for women? And that is young, unmarried, and married women now both went to work. All right, so usually it was just the unmarried women who were going to work. Some women actually went back to their roots as wives and mothers because they had to tend to the household duties. Some women decided to stay at work, and that's simply leaving a void at the home for their children. So the role of women was kind of sporadic during that war, and you can't say we won that war without their help. So don't forget what women did. All right. So the other group of people we want to make sure that we mention here during this time period, and that is African Americans. They contributed during World War I, and they will also contribute a large role in World War II. So African American contributions to the war effort is going to lead them to saying, hey, if I could fight for my country, if I could help you win a war, maybe I should be treated equally at home. So you have kind of an example here of maybe the Tuskegee Airmen here who would be, pilots during that war. So let's first look at what they did in the military, right? Over 1 million African American men and women served in the military during World War II. if you watched a documentary or anything about war, especially World War II, World War I, Civil War, you will notice that the military units, if the documentary is done correctly, are segregated. So there would be all African American units, all white units. So our military would not be desegregated until the Korean War. Right, originally only for supporting roles, but as the death totals and our casualties mounted, you'll see African Americans slip into those combat roles. So famous were the Tuskegee Airmen, first African American military pilots. Right, 994 fighter pilots. They fought in 2 wars overseas against a foreign enemy, and then when they got at home, they were fighting another war. Right, you can serve my country, but at home, I have to eat the hot dog out of the back door. I have to ride in the back of the bus, and I'm not going to be given a good job. So what you'll find is in 1948, President Truman will issue an executive order, which presidents are allowed to do, and that is ending military segregation. So no more black and white units. Korea, you'll find that black and white soldiers fought next to each other. And there's another iconic image of the Tuskegee Airmen for you. So what's happening at home for African Americans? Well, in 1940s, African Americans, once again, they did this during World War I, began moving to the northern cities from the south for job opportunities in those military factories. So if you're looking for your push and pull factories, right? The pull, what's attracting them? Economic opportunities. What's the push? They're facing discrimination down south. So they will meet discrimination in the north, but it's not as heavy as it is down south. So with competition for jobs and an influx of a new group of people, what we had in 1943 were some real race riots between white and black. So these happening in the midst of that war, and you see those in Detroit and New York City. Civil rights organizations begin to become, number one, more organized, more committed, and membership will grow in those. So gains were made in certain arenas. So politically, more African Americans were moving into urban areas, and that became a new voting bloc for some African American candidates. And economically, they're going to get those new jobs in those factories. But kind of an ugly piece to this would be they will still experience discrimination, and maybe there will not be some equal pay in terms of the salaries in their workplaces. So they're doing the works of white people, but they're not being paid as a white person would be paid. So there's where you find that inequality. That certainly wasn't right. And you'll see that develop more into the 1960s and the modern civil rights movement. So, kind of an interesting slogan here, right? There's this poor African American. He's allowed to stock the milk truck. If Negro men can carry guns, well, surely they can drive milk trucks for Bauman Dairy, right? And what he's saying is, when he got the job at Bauman Dairy, he's only being used as a guy who loaded trucks, right? So another group of people that you cannot forget about during this war, and that is the Japanese Americans. So I know in any one of your history classes you should have learned this, but if you didn't, here it is for you, right? Thousands of Japanese Americans face hardship and economic loss of their homes after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you'd see signs like this, especially on the West Coast. We don't want any Japs back here ever. Why? Certainly they're getting the blame for what happened at Pearl Harbor. So I'm going to give you a quick little history of Japanese Americans and what's happening with them. So most Japanese who did come, the immigrant populations that came, settled mainly on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, and into Nevada. By 1941, though, these aren't the immigrants who are here. So by 1941, these are second and third generation Japanese. All right, these are Nisei Japanese. They were never born in Japan. They've never been to Japan. They have no interest in going to Japan. These are American citizens, but they are of Japanese descent, right? So their parents or their grandparents may have originally come from Japan. These kids did not. They were born in America. They're American citizens. So what happens here is in 1942, after Pearl Harbor is attacked, 1941, President Roosevelt issues a very famous executive order, 9066. Right? And what it did is it established multiple military zones for taking Japanese Americans and imprisoning them. They didn't do anything wrong. But he felt that this was needed to protect America in case of a Japanese attack. So over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, once again, just because they're Japanese descent doesn't not make them American citizens. They are American citizens, right? Forced into these military camps that were guarded by troops and ringed with barbed wire. So this would be like the executive order. All persons of Japanese ancestry must pack up their goodies and move into a specific area. And we're going to have these military watching over these people, and they're going to be surrounded by barbed wire, and they're not going to be let out until 1945, so the war is over. So, well, when you look at, the Gila River, Manzanar, Topaz was a really huge one over in Utah. So the Heart Mountain was a bit. So these were the places that the Japanese Americans were taken out of California and moved further inland, moved into America, right? And that would be kind of an example. And it kind of looks like a concentration camp that you might see over in Europe. So keep that in mind. So one gentleman in particular, his name is Fred Korematsu. He does not want to go to this camp. He challenges the internment. He actually disappears, and they eventually catch him. And he says that I'm an American citizen. I should not have to go to this place. Well, famous Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. Supreme Court upheld the evacuation as a reasonable wartime measure. So if you can remember, what do we know about your rights during wartime? The Supreme Court said those rights can be limited. So no acts of Japanese American sabotage or treason were ever identified. There was no proof that these people did anything wrong to our nation, but we rounded them up like cattle and we put them into these camps. Thousands of Nisei fought for America during the war. These are second and third generation Japanese Americans who enlisted in the armed services. They joined the army to fight for their country. And meanwhile, back home, their ancestors, their aunts, their uncles, their little brother were being forced into these camps. So 1988 Congress paid each of the 60,000 interned Japanese American survivors $20,000. So this is in 1988. Kind of a long time to wait for that apology, right? But the federal government issues it, and it says that we're going to pay these people, right? So you cannot forget about Fred Korematsu, right? What did the Supreme Court say? Internment camps were legal because of that military urgency. And Fred Korematsu, years later in the 90s, will receive the Medal of Freedom from William Clinton, President Clinton, and apologies are made, but that's what the government decided at that time. And January 30th, once again, is known as Korematsu Day. The guy gets his own day. And if he basically said that he was trying to stand up for his rights as an American citizen. So if you feel something is wrong, don't be afraid. Speak up and take care of yourself. So oddly enough, the Nisei, the second and third generation soldiers, they proved their loyalty by serving their country in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, and primarily those soldiers were going to be fighting over in Europe and in Africa in the European theater. They are not going to be allowed to fight in the Pacific against their home country, if you will, right? So kind of three groups there you want to focus on: women, African Americans, and Japanese Americans, right? So here they are. Here's the Japanese men fighting for their country, joining the army. Meanwhile, back home, that their parents are being rounded up and put into these camps. So next thing we're going to look at on the home front is simply the kind of towards the end of the war. And once the war is over, we don't really need all these wartime goods anymore. So it's known as demobilization. So after the war, what do we need to do? Convert our nation from a wartime to a peacetime society. No longer are we going to be producing tanks and guns and bullets in our factories. We're going to be producing goods for the home. So that move from a military to civilian status. The armed forces, we had 12 million members enlisted in the armed forces. That number will shrink to 1.5 million after 1945. Factories will certainly switch from making military products to making consumer goods. And every segment of our population and every individual has a right to expect his government a fair deal. And this is kind of Harry Truman's idea of a fair deal. What he does is he kind of continues FDR's New Deal, right? So he called his program the Fair Deal. He aimed at promoting full employment, keeping the minimum wage laws that were enacted, greater unemployment compensation for the unemployed, and some housing assistance. So, I mean, for Harry Truman, that's kind of his idea of promoting that fair deal. If you need that information from the worksheet, you're going to have to get it from my voice posters. In the way. But keep moving on. Servicemen's Readjustment Act. So what else happens? We have 12 million people coming back to our country. We need to do something for the servicemen. We need to do something for the veterans. So what is known as, it's called the GI Bill of Rights. What our federal government did was they set aside billions of dollars for one group of people, veterans. Those veterans could use that money for college education, medical treatment, unemployment insurance, and home and business loans. So really low interest rates were being offered for veterans to build a new home, to go to college, to do something with themselves. So when you look at it, this serviceman's coming home. What did the federal government do? Said, hey, we're going to give you some money if you want to go to school. You're going to find a job. We're going to help you get some training, or you may want to open up your own business, or maybe you want to buy your own home. So we're going to help our servicemen as they come home. So the Employment Act that comes out as part of that GI Bill of Rights really made full employment a national goal. We wanted everyone in this nation to have a job. And it set up a council of advisors on economic issues for the president so we can continue to reach and achieve that goal, right? So the GI Bill of Rights, how does it help you? If you came home, if you were fighting in World War II, you came home, you got this flyer where you can go for job training or education. We're going to give you a loan to go to home or maybe a loan to go to school. So any of those things you could use that money for, all right? Continuing with that idea of demobilization, we had to protect our employees of the time. So what the Taft-Hartley Act did was it barred the closed shop. And what a closed shop meant was that workers had to join a union before they were hired. So kind of got rid of that. And right to work laws, workers could take jobs and actually not be forced to join a union. It did ban union contributions to political campaigns. It did not ban union contributions to regular union activities, but it required that union leaders swear under oath that they also were not communists, because there was a fear of communists in our country at that time. So because we're afraid of something, we got to keep an eye on it, and that leads us to dealing with national security. So in 1947, our government, right in the beginning of the Cold War, establishes the National Security Act, which basically was our way of keeping an eye on what we didn't like, and later it would be known as the Department of Defense. But what did it create? Created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which we like to think works very well with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and these two agencies today continue to look at individuals who are going to do harm to our country. The only other big issue on the home front at this time, and it is a big one, it's 75 million big, is the baby boom. So it is the largest population explosion in the United States in our history. 75 million babies were born from, I believe it was 1945 to 1952. I mean, it's an unbelievable amount of people. So what happens? If you have all those babies, you got to start building stuff for public services. Hospital wards were loaded, maternity wards were loaded, and we had to start building schools because there's no way we can fit all those kids into the schools that we had. So when you look at it's 45 to into the 60s, that kind of starts tapering off right there around the mid-50s. You start to see that number go down, but that is known as the baby boom. And you look at those red spikes right there, right? And what do you see? That would be a typical hospital in the 1940s and early 1950s, just loaded and littered with children coming in. So there's a lot going on the home front. I hope that helped you in terms of understanding changes at home because our nation's at war. So good luck, keep studying, and we'll see you soon. Bye.